Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Chapter 32, verse 12. Hashem badad yanchenu. God will leave them alone. Will place with them alone. Ve'ein imo el nechar, and there is no foreign God with him. Just what exactly is this pasuk saying anyway? So it's an interesting Ramban on this pasuk. Ramban on pasuk Beis. Hashem badad yanchenu. Hashem yashken es Yisrael betach badad. God will see to it that the Jewish people will be able to dwell securely alone. Ve'ein imo kinoi lashem o la Yisrael, and there'll be no foreign God with him. Could mean one of two things. It could either mean there'll be no other power other than God guiding the Jewish people, or there'll be no other God with the Jewish people. Okay, the idea here is Ki ein li Yisrael shoter umoshel mikol bnei Elohim sheyanchenu o yazor banchoso. No celestial being other than God himself has any dominion over the Jewish people. Bilti Hashem levado, except for God. As was said in verse 9, the Jewish people are the portion of God. Ubesifri Hashem badad yanchenu Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu kederach sheishavtem yichidim ba'olam hazeh v'lo nenesim min ha'umos klum. There's interesting medrash that God says to the Jewish people, the same way that you've sat alone in this world and you haven't really benefited from the nations of the world. Kachani asid lo shivchem yichidim lasid lavo. So too I will seat you alone in the end of days. Vein echa min ha'umos nana mikem klum. And none of the other nations will benefit from you. None of the celestial representatives of the nations of the world will be able to govern over you. Okay. So that's it's an interesting Ramban, but of course the point is that what God is saying is the Jewish people are our own category, and God deals with us himself. It's not necessarily the way that other nations are addressed. Okay, verse 13. Yarkiveu al bamosei aretz. God will ride the Jewish people on the heights of the earth. Vayochal tnuvos sadoi, and the Jewish people will consume the produce of the field. Vayenikeu dvash misela, and God will provide them honey from a rock, v'shemen mechamish tzur, and oil from a flint. Okay. Again, like so many psukim, where you kind of what exactly is going on here. There's an interesting sforno on this pasuk. Sforno on pasuk Yud Gimel Yarkiveu al b'masei aretz v'zeh yaseh me'achish lo hisik chefzo b'matan Torah niskar. The problem is that God had hoped that things would go a certain way after giving the Jewish people the Torah, and that the Jewish people would completely keep the Torah and everything would be elevated, etc. And then the Jewish people messed up. So now is plan B. And plan B is, even after the Jewish people have sinned, God is going to give them the land of Israel with the idea that they will keep the laws of Hashem. La shlimam b'markivam al chelek me'ha'aretz nisa b'makom v'mala al shar ha'aratzos. That God will make them complete by placing them with dominion over this land that's elevated over other lands. It's very interesting. Normally, the way you look at this pasuk b'masei aretz has to do with God puts the Jewish people over powers of the earth. The Sforno says that the pshat is God puts the Jewish people over the land of Israel, which is considered this like lofty land. So this is the second attempt at helping the Jewish people find spiritual completion. It didn't happen as was hoped with the giving of the Torah. So then ultimately when they get into the land of Israel, the hope is that it happens then. Just an interesting shot. Okay, now let's go on to verse 19. Vayar Hashem vayinatz. And God has seen, and he is disgusted, or he's angered, mikas banav uvnosav, from the anger of his sons and his daughters. And again, so There's an up and a down and a yin and a yang, whatever words you want to use. The Jewish people, the hope is that they'll do this and that they falter, et cetera, et cetera. So now this pasuk is highlighting another time the Jewish people falter. But what must jump out at to some, if not all of you, is why is it talking about the daughters? I want to be clear. It's not that it's strange that it's talking about women. Of course, it makes sense to talk about women, but we know certainly in biblical grammar, when you talk about a group of people that are both men and women, you could use a male form and it's inclusive of everyone. There's very rarely mention in the Torah of the men and the women. When it talks about the nation or the Bnei Yisrael, let me ask you, we talk about Bnei Yisrael. So does that mean only the men? Bnei Yisrael literally means the sons. Of course, Bnei Yisrael doesn't mean only the men. It means the children of Israel. So all of a sudden here it says, God became angered from his sons and his daughters. Why didn't it just say God became angered from his sons? Just like we talk about Bnei Yisrael. So it's just an interesting technical question. Two very different pshatim. The Ramban on Pasuk Yutes, Mikas banav uvnosav. Hakasav hiskir abanos bekan shelo kiminhag. The Torah mentions the daughters of Israel here. This is not the normal way of referring to things. Kasher amar lamala lo banav. By the way, there was a pasuk in this parsha that talks about how his sons acted in an inappropriate manner. It didn't mean his sons to the exclusion of his daughters. It meant his children. The total norm is to mention the sons, but it's understood to be both genders. And the daughters are included in that. This is from a point being alluded to. Resha Hanashim Ufishayan Gadol Ma'od Lachiso. They are in the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Presumably, we're talking about the first Beis HaMikdash. There is a unique role of women bringing about the wrath of God. Ki hayu nitzmados la'avodah zarah biyosir. One of the problems during the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash that brought about the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash was avodah zarah, idol worship. And the Ramban says that what's being alluded to in this pasuk, and the reason why it mentions the daughters explicitly, is because more than in most cases, the women of Klal Yisrael played a very central role in the sin. Kasher mefurish b'divrei Yirmiyahu vayanu kol hanashim yodim ki bekatros neshehem. If anyone remembers from the Wednesday morning class, we actually learned this together in Sefer Yirmiyah, that there was a whole showdown with Yirmiyah and the men arguing on behalf of their wives, that their wives were doing all kinds of avodah zarah stuff, and the men were pushing back against Yirmiyah, leave our wives alone. So it's very interesting. So the Ramban's pshat is the reason why it's out of the normal mode that it mentions the daughters, is it's to allude to the fact that the women of Klal Yisrael had a very central role in the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, because they were the ones who really were primarily involved in the avodah zarah of the time. An interesting pshat. The Sforno says something totally different. Sforno on Yutes, Vayinatz v'kas banav v'nosav, v'achar shelo hizig shleimusam ba'aretz, says the Sforno. So now the goal was, if you remember the Sforno we saw in verse 12, he brought them into the land of Israel. The hope is it's all going to be great now. It didn't go well there either. So now he decides to exile them again. In the wrath of God, he disgraced his sons and his daughters, meaning lo richim alaktanim v'lo al kvod habanos. In the exile, there wasn't unique compassion for the children or for the women. And that's the point here. So the reason why it talks about banav uvnosav is, first of all, his children, as opposed to saying amo, his nation, or something like that. The reason why it says his children is, of course, a child. Gosh, a person could have a child that could be 47 years old, but a child has a certain connotation of being young. So the point is, God's wrath was poured upon all ages, even those very young. And the Sforno says the reason why it mentions Benosav is even the women were victim to the wrath of God. So two very different pshatim. Whereas the Ramban says it's about hinting that women played more of a role in the sin than they normally have at other times. According to Sforno, has to do with how across the board God's wrath was. Okay. Verse 21. So God decides he's going to bring terrible calamities upon the Jewish people. Haim kinuni v'lo. They aroused my vengeance against an entity that's not even a god. In other words, they were comparing me to something that's not even a deity. Ki asuni b'havlehem. They angered me with their nothingness. Vani akniim beloam. I will arouse their jealousy with a nation that's not worthy of being called a nation. Begoy naval achisem. I will anger them with a nation that is naval. Now, I thought this was very interesting because we discussed naval earlier in the week, that there was a pasuk at the beginning of the parsha that referred to the Jewish people as Am Naval. And if you remember, we had all kinds of pshatim. So I just thought it was interesting to highlight that there's all kinds of pshatim on the nation that's going to cause problems for the Jewish people being described as naval. What does that mean? So if you look at Rashi on pasuk Kapala, it's like the third Rashi, I think, on the pasuk. Begoy naval achisein, elu haminim. This is a nation of heretics, people who don't appreciate God. Omer amar naval b'libo ein elokim. So a naval says in his heart, there's no God. So I don't think that's like the pshat Rashi said earlier in the parsha, if I remember correctly. But here Rashi understands that Am Naval means a nation doesn't even believe in God. In other words, you exchanged me for a non-existent God. I'll exchange you for a nation that doesn't even appreciate that I exist. And it's an interesting. Okay, let's see the Ramban. Begoy Naval Achisem, Esav, the descendants of Esav, which is normally associated with the Romans. Shehu Naval, the descendants of Esav are Naval, V'lo Zachar Bris Achim, and they didn't remember the covenant between brothers. And this alludes to both exiles. But the Ramban is being very consistent as Pshat and Naval. If you remember what the Ramban said at the beginning of the parsha, he said a Nadiv is someone who acts generously, even if someone hasn't done something for them in kind. And a Naval is someone who pays back good with bad. So that's the Pshat here, according to the Ramban also. The descendants of Esav, they should look at you and say, you're our mishpacha. But they're Naval. They don't see themselves as being connected to you. So it's certainly a related pshat. And finally, let's see the Sforno, the last Sforno on Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Begoy Naval Achisem, Shechrivo So Malchus, She'ena Hogenes. They act like an inappropriate government or nation destroys the temple. She'edlem Loksav Lo Lasham. They don't even have their own form of written communication. They don't even have their own type of language. So we had a translation like this, sort of like uncouth type of thing. So that's like unsophisticated. So that's the pshat. It's just interesting to see, again, when this word shows up, how you can have different ideas. So we discussed this morning what it means that Hashem treats the Jewish people alone. With the Ramban, we discussed Sforno with the novel pshat, what it means to ride the Jewish people on the heights. We discussed the Ramban and the Sforno regarding why it talks about the wrath on the sons and daughters. We were particularly struck by daughters, and we discussed what it means, a goy naval. It was Rashi, Ramban, and Sforno. I want to remind everybody we're not going to meet tomorrow. We're not going to meet tomorrow. We will meet Friday, God willing, but we're not going to meet